Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi, and welcome to the ISO Show. During the last episode, we talked about how to prepare for your next ISO surveillance audit. Now, if you're wondering what that is, if you didn't actually hear the last episode, then I definitely recommend you going back there if you are certified to an ISO standard. So basically, once you're certified to an ISO standard, doesn't matter which one it is, the certificate is valid for 3 years. And during that period, there is an annual surveillance audit. And I know that doesn't sound that nice, a surveillance audit, but ultimately it comes down to, proving what you say that you do year on year and that you are fully compliant with the standard. So it's more a case of assurance than anything else, really. Assurance to yourself, assurance to your leadership team and to your company that you are practicing what you preach and, of course, fully compliant with the standards. So there are many benefits that come with having that annual surveillance audit. It is a fresh pair of eyes on your business, so I definitely recommend treating it as an opportunity. So this episode is going to be focusing on the things that you need to expect during your surveillance audit. So this is quite often a question that we get asked, what should I expect during that ISO surveillance audit? And so that's why we're recording this episode for you. So what I've done is I've broken it down into 10 top tips. So I'll just run through those briefly now. And again, there isn't any kind of right or wrong way in terms of, having an ISO surveillance audit. These are just a few tips that we've put together for you. So number 1 is be prepared. So we'll be touching base on a couple of things that I covered during the last episode, very briefly. Number 2, it's the opening meeting. 3 are the audit questions and what to expect there. Number 4 is looking at some of the types of evidence that may be needed during your surveillance audit. And then 5 and 6 is going to be looking at on-site surveillance audits versus remote surveillance audits. Number 7, lucky for some, we're going to cover the auditor, the good, the bad and the ugly. Number 8 is the closing meeting, which I'm sure you'll be relieved to get to on the day. And then 9 is keeping on track. So sometimes those audits can go a little bit astray if we're not keeping on track with them. And yes, it is the auditor's responsibility to do that, but you're the auditee and your colleagues are, so it's about helping the auditor to stay on track during the day. And last but not least, number 10 is to try and enjoy it. And I know when you're listening to this, you might be thinking, well, how the heck am I going to enjoy something called a surveillance audit? Well, believe me, if you go the right way, you can actually enjoy it and have a really great relationship with your auditor. So without further ado, let's dive into top tip number 1, which is all about being prepared. So this was the focus of the last episode, so I'd strongly recommend you go back and listen to that if you haven't done so already. So one of the first things that you should do is familiarise yourself with the audit plan. Okay, that will set out what the auditor is going to be covering, when, and give you an idea on the topics of what he's going to be covering so you can line up the relevant people to be available during that audit as well. Secondly, you need to make sure that you and your colleagues are familiar with your company policies and procedures. Okay, so making sure that they're accessible, they're in the right place, and people have been made aware of them. That's absolutely crucial. Thirdly, make sure that you've got all the necessary records in place. So as we've touched upon on previous episodes, where the standards say you shall have, then they're expecting to see some evidence. And that's generally in the form of some type of documented information, such as an internal audit report or audit schedule. So the records for all sorts of activities that you can demonstrate. And we'll come on to that later on in the podcast. You also need to identify if there are any potential changes within the organisation that could affect the scope of your certification. That could be change to services or sites. And then last but not least, make sure that all of your training and awareness records are up to date. So more often than not, an auditor will ask to see records in relation to competency and awareness in relation to the standard that you're certified to. And that generally comes up in most of those surveillance audits. So yeah, I definitely recommend being prepared by just checking out what's on the audit plan and making sure that you've got everything in place, really. And number 2, the opening meeting. So every single certification body will start off with having an opening meeting. And the purpose of this is really to set the scene for the audit. So make sure that you've got all the relevant people involved with that audit available on that day. So if they are covering a specific aspect of the management system and you have a head of a function or head of that process, it would be advisable to invite them along to that opening meeting so they know what to expect. The auditor will be confirming the plan for the day and also asking you if there are any potential changes within the organisation that they need to be aware of. They will also be explaining the different types of audit findings. So some certification bodies will call these findings a OFI, an opportunity for improvement, a minor nonconformity, or a major nonconformity. And in previous episodes I've explained about some of these audit findings and what they actually mean. Also, you just need to bear in mind that some certification bodies call them slightly different things. So some certification bodies may call them critical or non-critical findings. Either way, your auditor will explain to you what the typical types of findings will be at the end of the day in the closing meeting, which I'll come on to explain about shortly. But they will also highlight these findings throughout the day as well, if any of them crop up. The auditor's also going to gauge at this very, very early stage the level of commitment from the leadership team to the management system. And that will be apparent by who's in attendance at that opening meeting. So I'd definitely advise having at least one representative from the leadership team available to demonstrate the level of commitment there. So that's the opening meeting. I mean, generally it only takes about 30 minutes. It could be an hour. But yeah, it's a good opportunity to be able to set the scene with both parties as well, both the auditor and the auditees. So moving on to number 3, audit questions. So if you've been through an assessment for stage 1 and 2, you'll already have experienced the fact that the assessor will be asking lots of questions to build up their portfolio of evidence of compliance. And it's exactly the same when it comes to your annual surveillance audit as well. So be prepared. There will be a lot of questions, but don't be worried about it. Okay, when those questions are asked, try and be specific as possible. So you don't necessarily need to waffle on and provide too much information, but then on the flip side, you don't want to provide minimal information either. Just try and provide them with the information that they're looking for. And don't worry if you don't understand the question. Auditors are very used to using the language of the standards, and so they might ask you a question on, let's say, context of the organisation, and somebody may not have a clue what they're talking about there. Don't worry about that. Ask for the auditor to explain it in a different way. So then the auditor may say, okay, could you show me an example of how you've identified risks and opportunities or issues as an organisation? Have you looked at internal and external factors when looking at risks and opportunities? So there are a number of different ways that an auditor can explain that particular question. So don't be worried about asking them to rephrase it in a way that you understand it for your business. That's so important, because otherwise you might just be guessing at the question and provide an answer to something that you think that they need, but actually that's not what they were looking for. So yeah, try not to take a punt. Just be open and honest and just say, oh, would you mind just rephrasing that in a different way? Or could you provide an example? Also, they might be asking a question about something that you're not familiar with because it's not your area of expertise. It's not an area that you're involved with as far as that particular activity within the business. So an example of that could be, them asking a question around, let's say, physical security access. That might be something that isn't your area of responsibility. Yes, you may be asked about that so that you have an awareness of it, that there are some physical security controls. But if they would ask you questions on, could you show me where the CCTV footage is located and how can you access that? Obviously, I'm talking about a specific standard here on the Information Security Standard ISO 27001. But I just want to provide an example here. It may be that you don't know that, you don't have the answers to that, and that's because that's privileged information that only certain people would have access to. So don't be worried if you don't know the answers, because it may be that there's somebody else within the company that does. And this is the beauty of having a management system where you've got shared responsibilities and accountabilities, because you will have specific people that take ownership for those areas. Now, sometimes an auditor might go quiet, but don't worry about it, okay? Yes, it is one of the oldest tricks in an auditor's book to try and, wait for further information to come across. But actually, more often than not, it's just a case of that auditor absorbing the information that you've given them and making notes, because obviously they're gathering evidence throughout the day. They're not going to memorize it all and write it all up at the end of the day. They will be taking notes. So sometimes they just need that breathing space to be able to collect their thoughts and capture that evidence in their notes as part of their report. So, yeah, it's not really advisable to argue with an auditor if you disagree with something. It's completely reasonable to have a discussion. That's perfectly acceptable if you're looking to seek clarification. And if possible, ask a question back to them on what it is exactly that they're looking for. Okay, so, and how that relates back to the standard. That's really important. So if it's something that you think, well, I don't agree with that nonconformity, you can say to them, okay, could you show me which clause in the standard that's against and why you're raising that as a nonconformity? You're just seeking clarification, that's all. You're not being difficult. You're just getting a better understanding of why that is actually a nonconformity. If they can't give you an answer, then it may be that they're actually asking a question based on a personal issue that they may have on something, and it's not actually a requirement of the standard, and it will become very clear when that happens if they can't explain which clause it relates to within the standard. Right, number 4, keeping on track. So as you can see, based on what I've just shared with you on the last point, sometimes discussions could continue and there is potential danger of running over time, which then could mean that other aspects of the audit are then rushed or not completed. And so it's in the auditor's best interest and your best interest to try and help them to keep it on track as well. So moving on to number 5. So on-site surveillance audits. So prior to COVID, pretty much 100% of surveillance audits would have been carried out on site. Okay, so I'm going to touch on this first of all, but as we know, many organisations have switched to hybrid working, and some of our clients' ISO surveillance audits are actually carried out remotely. So that's going to be number 6, which I'll come on to shortly. But either way, you need to be prepared for both. So firstly, with the physical audits then, it's always best to do a bit of a recce before the auditor arrives on site. I did touch on this in the previous episode. So let's say it's an environmental standard, just making sure that you are actually following your own company procedures as an organisation. So have correct items been put in recycling bins, or are you meeting the requirements from an environmental legal perspective as well? So just making sure that all of those things are in place. Make sure that reception, if you have one, are aware that you've got a visitor coming and that it is an independent auditor who's going to be auditing the company. It will keep them on the toes to make sure that they are actually meeting the company policies and procedures when it comes to visitors. Okay, so if you have got controls on issuing visitor badges, writing in a visitor book, making sure that the visitor is escorted, we need to make sure that that goes smoothly from the point of arrival, starting with whoever greets them, which could obviously be a receptionist. Also make sure that the office area that you're going to be using as a base for the audit is free from anybody else that may be discussing things that could cause an impact or influence the audit. So ideally not talking about any issues or complaints or last week's crazy night out. It's not necessarily going to be good for your business and its reputation, which I'm sure you'll follow this practice regardless, but it's just worthwhile noting. So ideally having a separate meeting room booked for the auditor to give them space to write up their audit report without any distractions. And also it's a safe place for other auditees to come in and have that conversation with the auditor as well to answer any questions. So moving on to number 6, remote surveillance audits. So since COVID, a number of surveillance audits are carried out remotely now. So if you've got any home working or remote working policies or procedures, obviously it goes without saying you need to follow those. But just a few common sense things as well is, making sure that you've got decent Wi-Fi so you're not getting disconnected if you are doing this from home. Making sure that others that are involved in the audit are on mute so that any background noise, can be minimised. And also the assessor will expect to see the auditee. Sorry, sometimes I flip on to assessor and auditor because quite often it's the same person. It's in some cases with some CBs it's called a client manager. Either way, just make sure that your auditees, those people that are involved with the audit, are visible on camera. And also, similarly to the on-site surveillance audit, make sure that you've got full access to all the necessary records to be able to share with the auditor during the audit. So moving on to number 7. So I've talked about this person often enough, the auditor, or as I've slipped into assessor occasionally. But the auditor is a human being just like you and me, and their aim is to support your business to raise standards. These ISO standards are all based on continual improvement, but they're just doing a job to make sure that your company is doing what it says it's doing, which is ultimately meeting the requirements of its policies and procedures in alignment with the ISO standard that you're certified against. Now, in our experience, the vast majority of auditors are excellent. They really are. They know their stuff, they know the standards inside out, and they have a wealth of experience of different industries too. So it's really worthwhile to try and get on their good side and develop a good relationship with them from the get-go. That said, there are a few auditors out there. They are in the minority, but they don't necessarily always play by the rules. And some examples of this could be that they send you their audit report from a personal email address. They shouldn't be doing that. They shouldn't be left to wander around premises unattended, especially if you're in some sensitive areas, such as a data centre. They shouldn't be able to just open doors and get access to whatever they want. They should be asking for permission first and for you to lead the way. And also, they shouldn't be taking any information off-site. And that goes for remote audits as well, okay? Unless permission has been given, of course, okay? So there isn't any reason why they should be taking any information away. If it's an online audit, I would recommend that you share that information with them there and then, or that there is a secure place for sharing that information, okay? But they shouldn't just be sent over information, especially not to a personal email address. And you might be thinking, well, why would they be using a personal email address? Well, some certification bodies employ contractors, so they are not on the certification body payroll. So it could actually be another consultant that is actually acting as your auditor and working on behalf of the certification body to carry out your ISO surveillance audit. So that's the only reason that they may slip up and send it from a personal email account, which I'm sure that the certification body wouldn't be happy that that contractor is doing that. So yeah, there are just a few tips on managing that relationship. And also something that I touched on earlier, which is, if an auditor is raising an issue, a particular finding that may be a minor nonconformity or a major nonconformity, and either you don't understand it or don't agree with it, ask for clarification and ask where it relates in the standard as well. So we're moving into the last few then. Tip number 8 is how to manage that closing meeting. Okay, so I'm sure you'll be looking forward to this at the end of that day. And actually, some surveillance audits go on for days if it's for multiple standards. So if it is only the one day, then you are quite lucky actually. But I think it goes without saying that if you're paying for a supplier to come into your business and to audit it against an ISO standard, against an example of best practice, and against your own company policies and procedures, take heed, listen to them and take note of that, because it's always useful, I believe, to have a fresh pair of eyes on your business. And remember, this auditor will have a wealth of experience and knowledge from potentially competitors in your industry or other industries where there may be examples of best practice that they've highlighted that your company could potentially benefit from. Okay, now obviously they're not going to be breaking any client confidentiality here, but it is definitely worthwhile taking a note throughout the day of any findings. So when it comes to the closing meeting, if you haven't had any questions answered yourself, you can ask them then, so you can seek clarification. Now there shouldn't be any surprises at the closing meeting. So you shouldn't have a situation where an auditor is hitting you with a major nonconformity at that stage. It should have been raised throughout the day and explained to you, okay, or through to that process owner that they were auditing. Okay, so when the auditor is going through the closing meeting findings, just make sure you're happy and understand all of the findings that have been given. And again, don't be frightened to ask any questions about it to seek clarification. It's also advisable to invite those people that were involved in the opening meeting to the closing meeting, okay, so that they can get feedback on how the day's gone. And again, it's just demonstrating another level of leadership commitment to your ISO compliance too. So tip number 9, evidence needed. So as mentioned earlier, all audits will take a factual-based evidence approach. So typically the type of records that will be viewed would be things like your audit schedule, audit reports, management review minutes, or some type of evidence that a management review has taken place. You'll have records for all different types of activities, so make sure that you've got those fully prepared. But other types of evidence would be, a latest copy of your policy statement, let's say if it's health and safety, or procedures as well. So just make sure that you've got all of that information available, and also that the appropriate version control has been applied. So if you've got document control procedures on how your documents should look, make sure that that's been followed. So I'm talking about things like brand guidelines, making sure that the correct branding is being used. Version control is used for the latest version reference number, and where possible, whether it's been dated and who it's been approved by. So it doesn't necessarily need to be on the document itself as far as version control is concerned. It could be accessed via SharePoint or a document control system. But providing that evidence is available, that's ultimately what an auditor will be looking for. So, last but not least is number 10, which is to try and enjoy the surveillance audit. So I know I mentioned earlier on that it might be difficult to believe that you could actually enjoy an ISO surveillance audit. But actually, if you develop a good rapport and relationship with your auditor, there isn't any reason why you shouldn't enjoy this journey. So there are lots of benefits of having a fresh pair of eyes on your business. It's a great way to be able to show off all of the hard work that you've been doing and your colleagues have been doing in order to raise standards within your business, and also to make sure that that management system is embedded and your colleagues are empowered to take responsibility for your ISO management system. So if you have been doing all of those things, then there isn't any reason, in theory, why you shouldn't enjoy that surveillance audit. And also, remember, at the end of the day, that report will be an endorsement of all of those efforts. So if there are a few OFIs, opportunities for improvement, that's great. It means you can continue to improve. If there are non-conformities, it means that some people obviously need to be able to make improvements within the organisation. That's generally what it comes down to. Certain people haven't been following those procedures. So, it's not a bad thing to get those highlighted and taken to the leadership team. So don't be disheartened if there are non-conformities. It's generally for a very good reason, and it's to improve your business. Okay, and that's ultimately why businesses implement ISO standards. It's not just about getting the badge. It's not just about, being able to submit a certificate in a tender. It is, or it should be, all about continual improvement. And that's something that I'm personally very passionate about, which is why I spend time recording these podcasts for you, is that it's all about that journey of continual improvement. So I hope those 10 tips have helped you to basically to get an idea of what's involved during your annual surveillance audit and, how to best prepare for it, with a few hints and tips along the way there. Now, we do have further guidance and support within the ISology Hub. So that's isologyhub.com, where we've got all sorts of things like e-learning, standards handbooks on how to maintain your management system, including preparation for ISO surveillance visits. So please feel free to go along to the ISology Hub website. If membership is something that you're interested in, then we would absolutely love to have you on board as a member. So I hope today's episode has been useful for you. Please do leave any kind of, feedback, comments. They're all really gratefully received. And of course, if you can leave a review, because any type of positive review really does help us to share our message about, the benefits of ISO standards and keys to success, really, with helping on the journey to continual improvement. So thanks very much for listening today, and I look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show.
Looking to achieve certification to an ISO standard, or just need a helping hand with ISO compliance? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com.